The story begins long before the world learned to pronounce his name with awe. It begins in the thin mountain air of Ethiopia, where history doesn't sleep quietly in books, but walks, breathes, and whispers through stone churches and ancient crowns. In 1892, in the town of Ejesa Goro, a child was born who did not cry into obscurity. He arrived carrying a name that sounded like a prophecy, Tafari Makonnen. Few could have imagined that this small boy, with alert eyes and a quiet dignity, would one day stand before the most powerful nations on earth and warn them about a danger they refused to see. Tafari was not born into poverty, but neither was he born into the absolute center of power. His father, Ras Makonnen, was a respected nobleman, a brilliant military leader, and a diplomat who had fought alongside Emperor Menelik II during the historic Battle of Adwa, where Ethiopia crushed Italian colonial ambitions and shocked the world. This mattered. It meant Tafari grew up in a household where politics, resistance, and African pride were not abstract ideas but daily conversations. From childhood, he was trained not just to rule, but to think. While other children played without care, Tafari was learning languages, studying diplomacy, and absorbing Ethiopia's ancient traditions alongside modern political ideas. He learned Amharic and Ge'ez, then French and later English. He read widely, listened carefully, and spoke sparingly. Even as a boy, there was something composed about him, something that made elders pause and pay attention when he entered a room. People noticed. Ethiopia noticed. When Ras Makonnen died in 1906, Tafari was still young, but the loss forced him into maturity early. Power in Ethiopia was complex, layered with tradition, royal bloodlines, and shifting alliances. Tafari learned quickly that survival required patience. He watched, he waited, and when opportunities came, he moved with calm precision. By his early 20s, Tafari had begun rising through the ranks of Ethiopian nobility. He became governor of regions, proving himself not with noise, but with results. He believed Ethiopia could remain deeply African and proudly ancient while still embracing modern systems of education, communication, and governance. This idea was radical. Many traditional elites feared change. Many foreign powers underestimated him. Both would regret it. In 1936, everything shifted. Emperor Ayasu V, Menelik II's grandson, was deposed after being accused of sympathizing too closely with Islam and threatening Ethiopia's Christian establishment. The throne could not be left empty, but neither could it be handed recklessly. A compromise was made. Menelik's daughter, Empress Zewditu, was crowned ruler. Tafari Makonnen was appointed regent and heir apparent. This was the turning point. On paper, Zewditu was empress. In reality, Tafari held the future in his hands. As regent, he controlled administration, foreign relations, and modernization efforts. Slowly, carefully, he began reshaping Ethiopia. He abolished some forms of slavery, expanded education, modernized the military, and opened Ethiopia to diplomatic relations with the outside world. In 1923, under his leadership, Ethiopia joined the League of Nations, declaring itself a sovereign African state in a world that believed Africa existed only to be ruled. That alone made him dangerous. To colonial powers, Tafari was an inconvenience. To Africans across the continent and in the diaspora, he was becoming a symbol, a living reminder that Africa had kings who bowed to no empire. But progress always attracts resistance. Conservative nobles pushed back. They whispered that Tafari was moving too fast, that he was undermining tradition. Several revolts erupted. Tafari crushed them, not with chaos, but with control. Each challenge strengthened his grip and sharpened his political instincts. In 1930, Empress Zewditu died. The moment Ethiopia had been quietly waiting for arrived. Tafari Makonnen was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia with full titles that echoed through centuries. His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, elect of God. The coronation was unlike anything Africa had seen in modern times. Kings, princes, diplomats, and journalists from around the world gathered in Addis Ababa. Radios crackled across continents. Newspapers printed photographs of an African emperor draped in gold and tradition, commanding global attention. For black people across the Caribbean, the Americas, and Africa, something profound stirred. In Jamaica in particular, preachers pointed to biblical prophecy and declared that a black king had been crowned in Africa. A spiritual movement was born that would later be called Rastafari, taking his pre-coronation name Rastafari and turning it into faith, identity, and resistance. Haile Selassie himself never claimed divinity. He remained a devout Ethiopian Orthodox Christian, but he understood symbols and he understood history. He knew that his existence alone challenged a racist global order that insisted black leadership was impossible. As emperor, he intensified his reforms. Roads were built, schools expanded, slavery was further curtailed. Ethiopia stepped cautiously but firmly into modern statehood. Yet even as he focused inward, danger was gathering beyond his borders. Italy had not forgotten Adwa. Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy, was obsessed with revenge and empire. He wanted Ethiopia to erase the humiliation Italy had suffered decades earlier. While the world distracted itself with economic depression and political maneuvering, Mussolini prepared for war. In 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia with modern weapons, tanks, aircraft, and poison gas. Ethiopia fought back with courage, but the imbalance was devastating. Villages were bombed, soldiers were gassed, civilians suffered unimaginable brutality. Haile Selassie personally went to the front lines, rallying troops, wearing military uniform, refusing to flee even as the situation worsened. But courage alone could not stop chemical weapons. In 1936, with Addis Ababa on the brink of capture, Haile Selassie made a decision that would define him forever. He left Ethiopia not in surrender, but in strategy. He believed his voice would be more powerful alive than silenced by execution. He traveled to Geneva to address the League of Nations. What happened next stunned the world. Standing before representatives of powerful nations, Haile Selassie delivered one of the most powerful speeches in modern history. Calm, dignified, and unwavering, he described the horrors unleashed upon his people. He warned that the poison gas used on Ethiopians would one day be used on Europeans. He exposed the hypocrisy of collective security that protected some nations while abandoning others. His words echoed like prophecy. It is us today, it will be you tomorrow. Many delegates listened in uncomfortable silence. Some laughed nervously, others turned away. The League of Nations failed Ethiopia. Sanctions against Italy were weak. Action was delayed. Mussolini marched into Addis Ababa and declared victory. But history was already taking notes. Haile Selassie lived in exile in Britain, a king without a throne but not without purpose. He continued to speak, to write and plan. And as Europe descended into World War II, his warning proved tragically accurate. Fascism consumed the continent. Poison gas, mass slaughter, and tyranny spread. In 1941, with the help of British and Ethiopian forces, Haile Selassie returned home. He rode into Addis Ababa not as a defeated ruler, but as a restored emperor. Crowds wept openly, bells rang, Ethiopia was free again. Yet freedom, he knew, was only the beginning.
When Haile Selassie returned to Addis Ababa in 1941, the city did not simply welcome a ruler back to his palace. It welcomed a man who had looked the modern world in the eyes, been betrayed by it, and survived. The cheers that lined the streets were not only for victory over Italy, they were for dignity restored. Ethiopia had been wounded, occupied, humiliated, but not erased. And the emperor who rode through those streets understood something deeply important. This second reign could not look like the first. He had seen the cracks in the global order. He had tasted exile. He had listened as powerful men debated his country's fate as though it were a piece of furniture. That experience changed him. The Haile Selassie who returned was no longer just a reformer trying to gently modernize an ancient empire. He was now a strategist determined to ensure that Ethiopia would never again stand alone. The scars of occupation were everywhere. Infrastructure lay in ruins. The economy was shattered. Thousands were dead. Collaborators and resistance fighters existed side by side, creating tension and mistrust. Haile Selassie moved carefully. He preached reconciliation, but ruled firmly. He knew that revenge could tear the country apart faster than any foreign army. One of his first priorities was rebuilding the state itself. He reorganized the government, reasserted central authority, and reformed the legal system. In 1955, he introduced a revised constitution that expanded the powers of parliament, at least on paper, and formally ended slavery once and for all. To the outside world, this painted Ethiopia as a progressive constitutional monarchy. To critics inside the country, it still concentrated enormous power in the emperor's hands, and they were not wrong. Haile Selassie believed deeply in order. He believed that Ethiopia, with its ethnic diversity and long feudal history, could collapse into chaos if power was released too quickly. He had watched newly independent states stumble. He feared fragmentation more than criticism. So while he modernized, he controlled. While he opened doors, he decided how wide they could swing. Education became one of his proudest projects. Universities were established. Ethiopian students were sent abroad. A new elite began to emerge, educated, ambitious, exposed to global ideas of democracy, socialism, and self-determination. Haile Selassie saw education as the engine of progress. What he did not fully grasp was that it would also become the engine of dissent. On the international stage, however, his influence grew immensely. In 1963, leaders from across Africa gathered in Addis Ababa. Many of their countries were newly independent, still shaking off colonial rule. Borders were fragile, economies were weak, hope was high, but fear ran just beneath it. Haile Selassie opened the conference with a speech that would become legendary. Calm, poetic, and commanding, he spoke of unity, warning that a divided Africa would remain vulnerable to exploitation. Out of that meeting was born the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, with its headquarters in Addis Ababa. This was not accidental. Ethiopia, never colonized, now positioned itself as the spiritual and political heart of African independence. Haile Selassie became a kind of elder statesman for the continent, mediating disputes, supporting liberation movements, and advocating African voices in global institutions. To many Africans, he was the face of dignity. To many black people in the diaspora, he was something even more powerful, proof. Meanwhile, the Rastafari movement was growing far beyond Jamaica. Inspired by his coronation titles, biblical interpretation, and Africa-centered identity, Rastafarians revered Haile Selassie as divine or messianic. When he visited Jamaica in 1966, the scene was overwhelming. Smoke filled the air, drums thundered, thousands gathered, weeping, chanting his name. Haile Selassie was visibly shaken. He did not reject them harshly, nor did he embrace claims of divinity. Instead, he spoke gently, urging Rastafarians to focus on education, self-worth, and eventual return to Africa if they so desired. Privately, he remained uncomfortable with worship directed at him. Publicly, he treated Rastafarians with respect, understanding that movements are not controlled by their symbols. But while his image soared globally, cracks at home deepened. Ethiopia's economy remained largely feudal. Land ownership was concentrated in the hands of nobles and the church. Peasants worked tirelessly with little reward. Famines simmered quietly in rural regions, ignored by officials eager to preserve the image of imperial stability. The emperor, surrounded by courtiers and insulated by protocol, received filtered information. What reached him was often softened, delayed, or distorted. Students began to protest, intellectuals questioned the pace of reform, soldiers muttered about poor conditions. The world Haile Selassie had helped shape was changing faster than his system could adapt. Then came the famine in Wollo. In the early 1970s, severe drought and mismanagement led to mass starvation in northern Ethiopia. Thousands died. The tragedy itself was devastating, but what followed was worse. Reports emerged that the government had known and concealed the crisis to protect the emperor's image. When the truth reached the public, anger exploded. For many Ethiopians, this was the moment something broke. How, people asked, could a man who spoke so powerfully for Africa allow his own people to starve in silence? Haile Selassie was now in his 80s. Age had slowed him. The political instincts that once served him so well began to fail. He reshuffled governments, dismissed officials, promised investigations, but the ground beneath the throne was already shifting. In 1974, unrest erupted across the country. Teachers went on strike, taxi drivers protested, soldiers mutinied. What began as scattered grievances fused into a national crisis. A group of military officers calling themselves the Derg emerged, claiming to act in the people's interest. At first, Haile Selassie underestimated them. He had survived coups, invasions, and exile before. He believed this too would pass. But this time was different. The Derg moved decisively, arresting ministers, seizing radio stations, and presenting themselves as reformers rather than rebels. Slowly, deliberately, they isolated the emperor from power. On September 12, 1974, Haile Selassie was deposed. The image shocked the world. The Lion of Judah, the conquering King of Kings, escorted quietly from his palace. No crown, no ceremony, no resistance. After more than 5 decades at the center of Ethiopian power, he was reduced to a prisoner in his own country. Many wept, some celebrated. History held its breath. The Derg accused him of corruption, misrule, and indifference to suffering. Treasures from the palace were displayed publicly as symbols of excess. His legacy was being dismantled piece by piece, not just politically, but psychologically. Haile Selassie said little. He was placed under house arrest, then moved to a small room within the palace complex. Cut off from the world, surrounded by guards who once bowed, he lived his final months in silence. In August 1975, the government announced that the former emperor had died of natural causes. Few believed it. To this day, many Ethiopians believe he was assassinated. His body was buried secretly beneath a latrine. The indignity was deliberate. The Derg wanted to erase not just the man, but the myth. They failed, because legends are not buried so easily. At this time, Haile Selassie's physical voice has been silenced, but his echo is everywhere, in African unity movements, in global black consciousness, in music, faith, and political thought. The man who once warned the world has become part of its memory, debated, defended, criticized, and revered. And the question lingers in the air, refusing to fade. Was Haile Selassie a visionary ahead of his time, or a ruler who stayed too long? The answer is not simple.
After Haile Selassie was removed from power, Ethiopia did not step into clarity, it stepped into a storm. The fall of the emperor created a vacuum so deep that it swallowed certainty itself. For decades, he had been the symbol holding the country together, sometimes by inspiration, sometimes by force, sometimes simply by habit. When that symbol was dragged away, Ethiopia had to confront a frightening question. Who were they without him? The Derg promised answers. They spoke the language of justice, equality, and revolution. They claimed they would correct the failures of the imperial era, redistribute land, uplift peasants, and give voice to the forgotten. At first, many Ethiopians listened with cautious hope. After all, anger against the old system was real. Hunger had been real. Inequality had been real. Silence from the palace had been real. But revolutions have a habit of eating their promises. Very quickly, the Derg revealed its true nature. Power concentrated in the hands of men with guns and ideology, but little patience for dissent. Political opponents disappeared. Fear became policy. The Red Terror swept across the country, staining the streets with blood. Families whispered at night. Trust evaporated. Ethiopia entered one of the darkest chapters in its long history. And in that darkness, something strange happened. Haile Selassie, the man the Derg tried to erase, began to grow larger in memory. People remembered his speeches, his dignity, his warnings. They remembered a time when Ethiopia stood tall on the world stage, when its passport carried respect, when Addis Ababa hosted Africa's dreams. Even those who had criticized his rule now compared the silence of the grave to the noise of terror. History, it seemed, was beginning to reconsider him. Outside Ethiopia, the reassessment was already underway. In the Caribbean, in the United States, in Europe, and across Africa, Haile Selassie's words continue to circulate. His 1936 speech to the League of Nations became required reading for activists and scholars. Musicians turned his speeches into lyrics. Reggae artists, especially Bob Marley, transformed his warnings into anthems that crossed oceans. Until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned. Those words were Haile Selassie's, spoken decades earlier, yet they sounded as though they were written for the present. For oppressed people around the world, he was no longer just an Ethiopian emperor, he was a voice of resistance carved into time. The Rastafarian movement deepened its devotion. To them, the news of his death was not an ending. Some believed it was false. Others believed it was spiritual, not physical. In Rastafarian theology, Haile Selassie did not die, he transcended. Ethiopia became Zion not just as a place, but as a promise. Ironically, while the Derg tried to destroy his image inside Ethiopia, they could not touch the version of him that lived beyond borders. But history does not belong only to believers or critics. It belongs to complexity. As years passed, scholars began to examine Haile Selassie's reign with sharper tools. They acknowledged his brilliance as a diplomat, his foresight in African unity, his courage against fascism. At the same time, they examined his failures without mercy. His slow land reforms, his centralization of power, his inability or unwillingness to hear the full cries of the countryside. The truth that emerged was uncomfortable but human. Haile Selassie was neither saint nor villain. He was a ruler shaped by his time, trying to guide an ancient empire through a modern storm using tools that were sometimes outdated, sometimes visionary, sometimes dangerously insufficient. And then, decades after his quiet removal, something extraordinary happened. In the year 2000, long after the Derg had fallen and Ethiopia had entered yet another political era, Haile Selassie was given a state funeral. The man once buried in secrecy beneath concrete was brought into the open. His remains were reinterred at the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa. Bells rang again, priests chanted, crowds gathered, the nation stood still. It was not a coronation, it was not forgiveness, it was acknowledgement. Ethiopia was finally ready to confront its past without fear. For many Ethiopians, the funeral reopened old wounds. Some wept for a lost era, others remembered suffering, but almost everyone recognized that Haile Selassie's shadow could not be erased from Ethiopian history. To deny him was to deny a century of the nation's story. Across Africa, his legacy remained woven into the fabric of independence. The African Union, successor to the OAU, still stands in Addis Ababa. Pan-Africanism still echoes with his words. The idea that Africa must speak with its own voice did not die with him, it grew. And yet, the most haunting part of Haile Selassie's story lies not in what he achieved, but in what he foresaw. When he warned the world about fascism, they ignored him. When he warned Africa about division, the continent struggled. When he believed modernization could be controlled from above, reality pushed back. His life became a lesson written in flesh and consequence. Power without listening decays. Tradition without adaptation fractures. Vision without inclusion isolates. Still, very few leaders anywhere in the world have faced what Haile Selassie faced and remained standing as long as he did. He fought colonialism not with rebellion alone, but with legitimacy. He challenged racism not with slogans, but by existing unapologetically as a black emperor on the global stage. He carried Ethiopia through invasion, exile, restoration, and transformation. By the time the 21st century arrived, Haile Selassie had become something rare in history, a man whose life could be used to argue opposing truths. To some, he remains the Lion of Judah, the defender of African dignity, the prophet whose warnings came true. To others, he is a cautionary tale of power held too tightly for too long. Both are correct, because history does not flatten people into one meaning. It allows them to breathe contradictions.
Haile Selassie's story does not end with his death. In many ways, it begins again in the imagination, in memory, and in the movements he inspired. By the late 20th century, his life had become a symbol of something far larger than the man himself. But to understand this, one must return to the Ethiopia he left behind, a nation fractured, struggling, and searching for identity. For decades, Ethiopia grappled with the Derg's brutal regime. The Red Terror decimated political opponents. Famines tore through the land. Cities emptied as rural populations fled. Schools closed. Farms failed. And yet, even amid the chaos, the memory of Haile Selassie persisted, not as a king on a throne, but as a standard of pride, endurance, and resilience. Everywhere, people remembered him differently. In Addis Ababa, older citizens told stories of his calm authority, of the speeches that stirred hope even in dark times. He had a way of making you believe that even the smallest Ethiopian mattered, one woman recounted decades later. Even when we were hungry, even when we were afraid, his voice made the impossible seem real. But memory is not uniform. For those who lived under his strict rule before the Italian invasion, Haile Selassie was sometimes remembered as distant, even aloof, a monarch who moved too slowly, whose reforms did not reach the suffering of the countryside fast enough. The tension between reverence and critique became a defining feature of his legacy. He was both a father to a continent and, in the eyes of some, a ruler out of touch with the pressing demands of his own people. It was outside Ethiopia, however, that Haile Selassie's legend took on almost mythical proportions. The Rastafari movement, which had emerged decades earlier, continued to grow. In the Caribbean, the Americas, and Europe, his name became synonymous with liberation, dignity, and the spiritual promise of Africa. Rastafaris believed in his divinity, not in the Christian sense he professed, but in a more profound spiritual symbolism, that his life and presence embodied hope, resistance, and the idea that Africa could produce leaders who commanded respect globally. Music became a vessel for this reverence. Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and countless others sang about Haile Selassie, embedding his story in reggae rhythms that crossed oceans. Even those who never saw Ethiopia knew of the emperor, not from history books, but from music, chants, and cultural memory. To millions, he was the living bridge between African heritage and modern liberation, between faith and action, between prophecy and reality. And yet, as the legend grew, so did scrutiny. Scholars, journalists, and historians revisited Haile Selassie's rule. They studied his methods, his decisions, his triumphs, and his failures. Some criticized his centralization of power, his slow approach to reform, and his inability to fully grasp the realities of rural life in Ethiopia. Others highlighted his diplomatic genius, his resistance to fascist Italy, his role in African unity, and the inspiration he provided to generations of leaders. What became clear was that Haile Selassie was not a simple figure to categorize. He was neither flawless nor ignoble. He was profoundly human, a man capable of brilliance and blind spots, courage and miscalculation. His life's arc, from prince to emperor, exile to liberator, prisoner to posthumous icon, revealed the complexity of leadership in a world that often pits morality against pragmatism, vision against circumstance. Haile Selassie's influence extended beyond politics. He had become a global symbol for human rights, African independence, and Black pride. United Nations delegates studied his speeches. Civil rights activists in the United States cited his warnings against racial hierarchy. African leaders invoked his calls for unity as they navigated the turbulent waters of post-colonial nation building. Even in pop culture, his image persisted. Stamps, coins, portraits, and songs immortalized his likeness, ensuring that the emperor who once rode through Addis Ababa with dignity could continue riding across the world, transcending borders and generations. Back in Ethiopia, the eventual fall of the Derg regime in 1991 created an opportunity to re-examine the emperor's legacy. Once again, Ethiopians faced the complex truth of their history. Haile Selassie had been a ruler of immense vision and profound limitations. The new government sought to balance remembrance with accountability, honoring his contributions while acknowledging the hardships endured under his long reign. The 2000 state funeral, when his remains were reinterred in the Holy Trinity Cathedral, symbolized this reconciliation, acknowledging the emperor as a central figure in Ethiopian history while allowing the nation to move forward. Haile Selassie's story continues to live not only in Ethiopia or the Caribbean, but across the globe. His life represents the possibility of resisting oppression with dignity, of asserting national sovereignty in the face of global indifference, and of maintaining moral authority even when it is inconvenient. He reminds the world that leadership is both a privilege and a burden, that one's decisions ripple across decades and continents, and that the power of example can outlast the power of force. And yet, despite all the reverence, the music, and the scholarly debates, Haile Selassie's true legacy is perhaps the most intimate, the way he made individuals feel connected to something larger than themselves. For Ethiopians, he represented a link to a proud history stretching back to the Solomonic dynasty, to the victories at Adwa, to a civilization that had never been fully colonized. For Africans and the diaspora, he embodied a vision of a continent that could stand independently and with dignity. For oppressed people worldwide, he symbolized courage in the face of overwhelming odds. At this point, Haile Selassie's life is no longer simply a biography of an emperor. It is a meditation on the intersections of power, morality, and identity. His story asks timeless questions. How do leaders balance progress with tradition? How do nations survive when faced with betrayal and violence? How can one individual embody the hopes of millions without becoming lost in the weight of expectation? The answers are neither simple nor final, but in the echoes of his speeches, the rhythms of music that bear his name, and in the hearts of those who continue to look to Africa with hope, Haile Selassie's life remains a beacon, a story that refuses to end, a legacy that challenges each generation to arise, to act, and to believe that dignity, courage, and vision can leave a mark that survives time itself.
In the end, Haile Selassie's story circles back to a single, haunting truth. Some lives refuse to stay in the past. Long after the emperor's voice was silenced, long after his crown was taken and his body hidden, his presence continued to move through history like a quiet drumbeat, steady and unignorable. To understand Haile Selassie is not to arrive at a neat conclusion, but to stand at the crossroads of contradiction, power, hope, and consequence. By the time Ethiopia entered the new millennium, the world had changed beyond anything the young Tafari Makonnen could have imagined. Empires had fallen, new nations had risen, technology shrank distances.
Yet the questions Haile Selassie wrestled with remained stubbornly familiar. How does a people protect its dignity in a world designed to exploit the weak? How does tradition survive without becoming a prison? How does leadership serve millions without losing sight of the individual? In Ethiopia, younger generations who never lived under his reign began encountering Haile Selassie not through personal memory, but through stories, debates, and history lessons. Some saw him as a hero who preserved Ethiopian sovereignty and placed Africa on the global stage. Others saw him as a monarch who failed to adapt quickly enough to the needs of his people. What mattered was that he could no longer be ignored. He had become unavoidable. Walk through Addis Ababa and his shadow still appears, in architecture, in street names, in old photographs tucked inside family albums. Mention his name and conversations deepen, voices lower, opinions sharpen. His legacy is not casual, it demands engagement. Across Africa, his influence still breathes in the institutions he helped shape. The African Union, standing where the Organization of African Unity once stood, continues to echo with his call for unity. Though African nations still struggle with division, foreign influence, and internal conflict, the idea that Africa must define itself on its own terms remains central. That idea did not originate with Haile Selassie, but he gave it form, language, and a global platform. In the wider black diaspora, his impact may be even more profound. Haile Selassie represented a living contradiction to centuries of imposed inferiority. He was educated, articulate, globally respected, and unapologetically African. For descendants of enslaved people, his existence alone was a form of resistance. He made Africa visible not as a wound, but as a source of pride. This is why his words continue to be quoted, why his image appears on murals, album covers, and banners at protests, why his speeches feel eerily current. He did not speak in the language of rage, but in the language of warning and principle. He believed injustice, if ignored, would spread. History proved him right again and again. Yet to elevate Haile Selassie without confronting his flaws would be dishonest. His reluctance to decentralize power, his delayed response to internal suffering, and his dependence on feudal system that no longer served the majority contributed to his downfall. Leadership, his life teaches, is not measured only by survival or symbolism, but by responsiveness. The same authority that protected Ethiopia from colonial domination also insulated him from the cries of his people. And still, even this failure holds a lesson. Haile Selassie's fall did not erase his achievements, just as his achievements did not excuse his mistakes. Instead, his life stands as a full human story, one that resists propaganda from both sides. He was not a god despite the faith that surrounds him. He was not a tyrant despite the accusations leveled against him. He was a man navigating extraordinary pressure, ruling during a century that demanded more from leaders than tradition alone could provide. Perhaps this is why his story endures, because it mirrors our own struggles as societies and individuals. We want heroes without cracks, leaders without contradictions, victories without cost. Haile Selassie offers none of these illusions. He offers truth shaped by time. In his most famous warning, he told the world that injustice anywhere would eventually threaten justice everywhere. He was speaking about poison gas, fascism, and imperial betrayal. But the warning stretches far beyond his moment. It speaks to inequality, to silence, to the danger of looking away when others suffer. Today, as the world wrestles with new forms of domination, economic imbalance, cultural erasure, and political instability, Haile Selassie's life feels less like history and more like a mirror. His victories remind us what courage can accomplish. His failures remind us what happens when power listens too slowly. And maybe that is the final gift of his story. Not a crown, not a throne, not even a legend, but a challenge. A challenge to leaders to govern with humility. A challenge to nations to protect their people before their image. A challenge to the oppressed to remember their worth. A challenge to the world to listen before it is too late.
Haile Selassie once stood alone before powerful nations and spoke truth they did not want to hear. He paid a price for that courage, yet his voice survived louder than the laughter that once mocked him. As this story closes, the Lion of Judah no longer roars from a throne or a battlefield. It roars from memory, from music, from movement, from the quiet realization that dignity once asserted can never be fully taken away. And so the story of Haile Selassie does not truly end here. It waits in every struggle for justice, in every call for unity, and in every generation bold enough to believe that Africa and humanity itself deserves better.